Coming up on Avant Technology Insights with Ken Presti.
There are way more security holes that are being opened, essentially. And this is because of IoT, OT, the growing attack surface.
Major changes have hit the cybersecurity space in 2020, brought about partly by the effects of COVID-19 and the resulting economic effects and corporate vulnerabilities. We've seen a dramatic uptick in cybercriminal and nation-state actors trying to leverage the global pandemic as an opportunity to launch new attacks, many of which exploit the expansion of telecommuting and working from home. Meanwhile, ransomware and other exploits continue to grow in popularity among the criminal minds. We'll be looking at all of this through the eyes of one of the architects of the recently released Threat Landscape Report from Fortinet, right after this. Welcome to Avant Technology Insights. I'm your host, Ken Presti, Research Vice President of Avant Research and Analytics. The link between solving business challenges and cutting-edge technologies has become tighter and more complex than ever before. In this podcast series from Avant Research and Analytics, we help enterprise decision-makers sort through the business case, the value, the challenges, and ultimately the bottom line of technology adoption. So listen to us at your desktop, take us in the car, tune in from the commuter train, or download us at the gate. You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, and Google, as well as at www.goavant.net/podcast. My guest today leverages more than 15 years of cybersecurity experience towards the ultimate goal of making a serious dent in cybercrime. His work has included meetings with leading political figures and key policy stakeholders, including law enforcement, who help define the future of cybersecurity. He is actively involved with several global threat intelligence initiatives by NATO, Interpol, and others. He's been featured on CNN, Bloomberg, NBC, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and other media outlets. He's the Chief of Security Insights and Global Threat Alliances for FortiGuard Labs at Fortinet, a prominent California-based IT security company. I want to welcome Derek Manky. Derek Manky, thank you very much for joining us today. Some exciting times over at Fortinet, I guess. The Global Threat Landscape Report for this year is now out. Why don't we start by giving me an overview on how that report is developed and the type of research that is used to support it?
Sure. Hey, thanks, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here. So twice a year, FortiGuard Labs, my team, we release a report on a summary of the threat landscape, everything that we've seen over the last 6 months for the first half of 2020 in this case. And, my team pulls this information from a lot of different sources. We have our core threat intelligence source with FortiGuard Labs. We have over 6 million sensors worldwide where we collect data on attackers, right? So we get to understand in any given minute on the threat landscape, current snapshots as to, what are the latest attacks, exploits, hacking attempts, what verticals are they going after, what geo regions, what attack techniques, what malware, attack methods and tools, and so forth. So we do that even up to the level of playbook development, so attribution on cyber criminals and working with law enforcement. So there's a lot of interesting areas. But with this report, what we do, instead of looking at just on a per minute or per hour basis, there's a lot of data out there. We get over 100 billion, not million, but billion threat events a day that we have to process. So there's a lot of big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning behind the scenes. And if you can think of 6 months of that data, half a year, it's astronomical. So there's a lot of magic behind the scenes that we do. We normalize that data, we look at it, and then we put it into a nice report. And that's what brought us to today with the Threat Landscape Report.
Sounds great. As you got to the far end of that, once you guys were ready to hit the publish button and you were looking at it that final time, was there anything in particular that jumped out at you in terms of the results? Something that made you say, ooh, I didn't think it was going to go that way, or yeah, that makes total sense. That's got to be the way it is, and this is what everybody needs to know.
So I would say, I have 20 years of experience in cybersecurity. So to myself, there were I wouldn't say there were any stunning surprises. A lot of things were expected, but not necessarily in a good way. I mean, it's not good news expected, right? I mean, like, and to be honest, well, if you were to ask me that before January, of course, before COVID, I would have said that this would be completely surprising, of course, because COVID did even really dramatically shift the threat landscape for 2020. So that, in essence, without previous knowledge of this happening, definitely had a significant impact, a lot of surprises, a lot of influence on the threat landscape and attack. And in fact, that was one of the first highlights that we called out in the report, was that coronavirus was obviously rampant in a cyber in a cyber way.
So when you look at that and you think, okay, here's a situation where people are telecommuting, people are working from home, offices are being closed down, what sort of exposures did you see that start to open up? And how fast were the bad guys at grabbing onto that and running with it?
Yeah, very quickly. Cyber criminals, they always move in a very agile way because they don't have a lot of restrictions when it comes to their end, unfortunately. And this is something that we're obviously working together in the industry to try to solve, to create more barriers for them to break down and more restrictions in terms of eliminating safe havens that they can operate in. But if we look at how quickly they're able to move, very quickly. I mean, if we look at coronavirus specific campaigns, so we define campaigns as an operative that one cyber criminal group usually will pursue. So this is usually social engineering lures that they use in emails, as an example. And if we look at what happened in the first quarter of this year, they jumped on the bandwagon really quick when it came to leveraging coronavirus-based lures in various ways. Of course, back then it was things like using termination notices, layoff notices, from HR as an example, to impersonating health authorities. And a lot of these were regionalized. At its peak in March, we were seeing over 640 different attack campaigns that were occurring on a daily basis, which is way larger than the baseline we normally see. And Ken, this is because this was a global pandemic, so it became a global operation for cybercrime, and that's the key difference, right? If we look at a lot of traditional attacks, when they hop on hot news, it's usually a regionalized event. It could be a natural disaster, as an example. So it's usually targeting one region. It'll last 1 to 2 weeks. This has lasted 6 months plus, and we've seen over 60 different languages, as an example, that have been used for these social engineering lures. And it's followed the curve too. It's went from this initial where everything shutting down from the pandemic to phase 2 reopenings and social engineering lures following that too.
So when you look at that from the standpoint of those numbers that you were talking about, how would you compare that to the world prior to COVID? Double, triple, less than that, more than that?
Oh yeah, we're seeing that double volume for sure, and yeah, and like I said, the spread of this, the global nature and spread. If we look at the amount of regions that were hit with this, that would be more than triple, and we're talking exponential, because we typically don't see one campaign that hits that amount of reach. So that's been the key difference, is the reach. We call this the attack surface. And the interesting thing is that we actually saw those, as people started becoming aware of these social engineering lures, and we went to that transition to work from home, that number I mentioned, the over 600 campaigns a day in March, that started dropping. It essentially halved every month. So in April, it was down to the 300 range. May, it dropped. And June, July, we started to see numbers in the double digits, so around 50 to 60, which is good news, of course. And that was an effort from the industry. But as highlighted in our report, and this was the second highlight, is that we actually saw for the first time in a very long time a shift from email being the most dominant attack vector to web-based threats being dominant. And, this is a result of all of those laptops and employees going from their corporate safeguards going onto their home networks. Of course, email is typically secured centrally through organizations. Web traffic is not always, and this is why the favorism went to web-based attacks for cyber criminals.
Why would that have been declining over time? I mean, is it something that the corporations did to tighten up the security aspect of it? Did they move on to something else? I wouldn't have expected that those numbers would have declined over on a month by month basis.
Yeah, so just keep in mind when we talk about the decline, it's a shift, right? So it's not
Mhm.
the attack volume in total didn't decline. It's just that it was shifting to web-based attacks from email because email is
Ah,
becoming less effective. But the reason it was becoming less effective was exactly that. I mean, there was obviously a focus to shift policies to work from home. There was a lot of education out there on, we did that as a vendor, obviously with Fortinet and FortiGuard Labs, a lot of, education on blogs. We even worked on partnerships like cyber hygiene campaigns with Interpol as an example. So, there is also a law enforcement aspect of it. And, it was basically just a lot of this collaboration in the industry that was happening that actually did have a good impact for those campaigns that were happening on email. But unfortunately, like I said, this turns into a game of whack-a-mole sometimes, and it was just a shift of weight going from email to web-based attacks.
oh, it's a total game of whack-a-mole. It really is. Once you close one, one opening, another one opens up, and I mean, it's almost a platitude to say that the security people need to be right all the time, but the bad guys only need to be right once.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's just one of those things that, especially with that new opening, because now people are working from home. And aside from the things, the emails and the web exploits, we're trying to reach you because a family member is sick or what have you. The fact that they're now working on an extension off of the corporate network that is now just somebody's regular DSL connection. What are some of the ways that companies need to combat this? What can companies do to protect themselves from exactly this kind of thing?
yeah, really good question. So, first of all, when we look at our strategy to mitigate, attacks and cybercrime, our goal is always to make it more expensive for the cyber criminal to operate. And there's different ways to do that. Obviously, there's ways that we do on the back end with FortiGuard Labs, as I said, to actually disrupt cybercrime and slow it down. But for organizations, they can also have a hand in this through tightened security policies. So education, a lot of free things, right? Tools like education, doing phishing campaigns and training against employees, and as an example, that brings it front to mind all of the time. But then obviously, security solutions themselves, and particularly when we need to talk about moving beyond the perimeter here, and this is going to be the new normal, quote unquote, right? This is going to be where we're headed beyond COVID as well, in the world of 5G, as an example. We no longer live in a perimeter security world purely, right? And that's
Mhm.
obviously evident now with all these employees going home on those regular DSL connections, like you said. So a couple of things. One, you have to understand the attacks, and the attacks that we have saw. This is another highlight: is that the top exploits, so the top hacking attempts, top targets that we saw in the first half of 2020, were going after consumer grade routers. That was a first, actually, that we saw consumer grade routers at the top of the list, as well as IoT devices. So we're talking about network attached storage, printers, DVR devices, and even gaming platforms now too. So
Mhm.
understanding that these devices coexist on the networks that these employee laptops are living on, things like segmentation. So beyond so basically setting up a perimeter at home for these networks, so using segmentation from those other devices, because that is the preferred attack route that we're seeing, is what we call springboard attacks, or lateral movement, because in reality those devices are way easier to compromise than a hardened version of Windows 10, as an example. So using proper segmentation, and then of course things like multi-factor authentication, so two-factor authentication, using tokens as an example for credential access to services, to corporate services, using things like software as a service as well, combined with that two-factor authentication, VPNs. also go a long way. Again, a lot of these traditional tools that we talk about for years are incredibly important now, even of course down to patch management. IPS protection as well is really important for these networks, as well as secure Wi-Fi access too. So having the proper security through Wi-Fi in your home networks is also important.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Are you seeing much in the way of man-in-the-middle attacks where, okay, you can go ahead and secure the actual device, but if they can get into that Wi-Fi network, they can do a lot of harm?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and that is precisely why the top attack that we saw was consumer grade routers. A lot of these consumer grade routers have Wi-Fi access built in, and yeah, if you can compromise that device, you can control DNS traffic, as an example, set up your own phishing sites. We're also, the other thing. The other thing is, in a sense, we're going back to some of the attacks that were popular, 15 years ago when Wi-Fi first came out. War driving, as an example, right? So this is trying to actually physically get close to some of these Wi-Fi access points because they are juicier targets now. So that's
Mhm.
another interesting angle.
So you're talking about somebody parking their car out in front of my house and tapping in?
Right. Yeah. Again, that what was popular about 15 years ago, attackers played off of insecurities in, Wi-Fi authentication itself. So we're talking about like WEP as an example, right? There were no very well known vulnerabilities, and then WPA2 came out and so forth, and it became harder to attack. But the reality is still a lot of these consumer grade routers have default passwords on them, so that's obviously security 101, things that need to be changed. And like I said, the bigger problem is that there are more of these consumer grade routers and more vulnerabilities being discovered, and that kind of leads to into our next highlight on the report, is that we called it the age of exploitation here. But the other highlight that we saw, and the consumer grade routers as an example are a piece of this, is that we are on pace this year so far. We're eight and a half months in now, and we're on pace to shatter the record of the amount of vulnerabilities that have been discovered in a year. So what that means is that there are way more security holes that are being opened, essentially, and this is because of IoT, OT, the growing attack surface. And as we know, it can take years to fix these holes sometimes.
And what are you seeing with regard to ransomware? I saw in the report that ransomware itself, which prior to COVID, that was also one of the big attacks, attack vectors or attack vectors that we were worried about. And now that I understand is evolving somewhat as the cyber criminals seek to up their games.
Yeah, ransomware is a always an interesting topic. It's something that's, I don't think, ever going to go away now. It's it first surfaced in large. It's been about 10 years anniversary, I would say, in terms of volumetric attacks. The world's first ransomware virus actually came out in 1989, asking for money through snail mail, which wasn't too effective at the time. But in 2010, of course, we saw this shift from fake antivirus software, which was effective for about a year. Fake software that was saying that you had 50 threats on your system and you had to buy this bogus, cleaning
Mhm.
tool. People caught on to that. It was optional too, to buy this tool or just remove it. Of course, ransomware became more persistent. And so 10 years ago, we saw basic flavors of ransomware, and then we saw private, asymmetric encryption, so public-private key management. Each system had a different key that the criminals were using, so it was harder to reverse the damage. What we saw this year is that ransomware is becoming more clever now. Attackers are becoming more targeted with their ransom attacks. So the ransomware in general still exists, and it's a big business model for cyber criminals. Um, we're seeing more advanced, more sophistication with the code itself. So sandbox evasion, as an example. using things like master MBR infectors we saw this year. So that's master boot record infecting ransomware, which means that the ransomware has a hold on the system before Windows will even load, or whatever operating system, but mostly the Windows we're seeing. So
Yikes.
yeah, so that gives them, even more power and more persistence, obviously, on the system. But the other larger problem, in my opinion, is that they're starting to hone in on their ransom attacks and using not just ransomware. So data was the currency, as always has been, right? But using that data
Mhm.
for extortion now, as an example, threatening to publish intellectual property, going after things like essential, critical business revenue streams. That is, I think, something that we're going to really see an explosion of, especially with OT, operational technology, in the next year or so. But these attacks are big money to attackers, because if they go after a revenue stream that's generating $2-3 million a day, as an example, and they cripple that, they know that's going to be a lot of value to the organizations, and they're going to, they're demanding, 7-figure ransom payments for these. So it's an essentially a denial of service by using it for ransom, right?
Yeah, and I saw in the report they were talking about parking the data on the dark web, and you alluded to that a moment ago, so that not only are you locked down, but if you don't give them their bitcoins, they're going to release that so everybody can see all your data and do whatever they want.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And
That's scary
yeah, and I'm
stuff.
sure a lot of the times too, if you're thinking like a cyber criminal, it's some of that may even be doctored as well too. So further, it could have even further impact um, on brand reputation and so forth.
I noticed in your report there was a mention of Stuxnet. That kind of took me back to simpler times. To what extent is that still a force in the current security landscape? Are there still variants of that floating around?
Yeah, so June this year was marked the 10th anniversary of Stuxnet. So that's why we had sort of
Hmm.
reflected on, where have we gone in 10 years in terms of SCADA, industrial control attacks. And so Stuxnet itself, no, that was isolated 10 years ago. But what
Right.
we have seen is a focus on Stuxnet-like attacks that are resurfacing. And this is something, to be honest, I was actually expecting to see this a couple of years ago. Industrial control networks are always a prime vector for attackers. I think in reality,
Mhm.
attackers have enjoyed a lot of success off the low hanging fruits. Going after everything we talked about, ransom attacks and so forth. But yeah, the critical infrastructure become obviously a lot more severe in nature, and what we saw this year were, we did a detailed blog with FortiGuard Labs on the ECANS ransomware as an example. So it's also known as Snake. This is a ransomware targeting industrial control systems. So HMIs, human machine interfaces, that will essentially do a whole bunch of process killing, remain persistent, demand ransom. And it's just like I talked about before, these critical, not just revenue streams in those cases, critical services to
Sure.
civilization.
Derek, there was a time when I would mention SCADA attacks and people's eyes would glaze over because they hadn't happened yet, at least not in any meaningful way. Um, Given that we've all been kind of knocked off our horse a little bit by coronavirus, are you seeing more respect paid to things that have not happened but remain as a constant threat? And I could see SCADA, I could see Corona being one of those things that would make us look at SCADA and think, ooh, even though it hasn't happened in any big way yet, certainly that's a risk. And given where we are now, we can see how that would be at perhaps a higher level than we otherwise would.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is sort of what I was hinting at what's on the horizon. I mean, if I were to look forward to where are we going after this, what's the prime attack target? I would say number one in terms of vertical is OT, operational technology. That includes SCADA, but it's a wider swath.
Hmm.
That includes medical devices, healthcare. In fact, during the first half of 2020, unfortunately, it's quite sad, but cyber criminals obviously they don't think about this. feel that, but they're going after the most vulnerable people, which in terms of vertical was healthcare, right? Because you had all these pop-up shots, obviously critical nature for that had to respond on the front lines. A lot of new networks that were just hastily being set up and therefore were vulnerable. There's a lot of medical devices that are connected to these networks, and that was one of the prime attack vectors that we saw as well in terms of vertical. And moving forward, I think healthcare will still continue to be a prime attack vector, but also operational technology in large, and that's going to be even further complicated with 5G. We're moving from IoT to IoT integrated with 5G, which is going to cause an explosion in attacks, I think.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on that. So, if you look at this Rubik's Cube of threats that are evolving out there, what advice do you have for the trusted advisor community, the agents out there, in keeping up to speed with the ongoing development of these threats and finding ways to protect against them?
Yeah, so just kind of summarizing what we talked about. First of all, think about moving beyond that perimeter. I think that's critical now. This is, again, the quote unquote new normal that we talk about. The reality is we have all these endpoint devices for remote workers. So really securing that should be first and foremost. Thinking about all those attack vectors, ensuring that those devices are segmented, having proper secure Wi-Fi access, IPS inspection, multi-factor authentication through software as a service, as an example, are all good steps. And ongoing education, I think, is really important for that. Following security blogs like the ones we put out at FortiGuard Labs, but also really, security departments staying in tune weekly with their employees, I think is, from a CISO perspective, I think that's really important. It's more of a process procedure, but something that goes a long way. Also reviewing ransomware security measures. Like I said, the ransom attacks are front and center. There's a lot of different ways to mitigate those threats, including backups, but not having backups on the same segments or location on the network, of course. Those sorts of things, and then also having a full response, incident response strategy is really important as well. Inspection for VPN traffic is also important. VPNs are good, of course, but if you have a device that's compromised that is going through VPN, through an already cleared security access, as an example, you still need to inspect that for potential threats like botnets and so forth.
Yeah, so quite a to-do list for the people in the IT security space, without a doubt. Derek, where can we get our copy of the report?
Yeah, sure. So we release this. You can go to FortiGuard.com. We have all the latest updates from FortiGuard Labs. We also have our security blog on blog.fortinet.com. And if you go to Fortinet.com, you can find our global threat landscape report. It's under our threat report assets on the site.
Awesome. Derek Manky, Chief of Security Insights and Global Threat Alliances for FortiGuard Labs at Fortinet. Thank you very much for being our guest today. These types of discussions always get me a little bit nervous, but it probably makes me nervous in a good way. So, because it's important to understand these things so that we can protect ourselves from the threats. And you've certainly done a great job of netting that out for us, and definitely would recommend that people read the threat landscape report from Fortinet as soon as possible. A lot of great information in there. So thank you very much for joining us today.
No problem. It's a pleasure. And yeah, keep in mind that we're doing this behind the scenes to make it easier for people. So all that intelligence also gets baked into our security fabric to mitigate these threats.
Awesome. Derek, thank you very much. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much, Ken.
You've been listening to Avant Technology Insights, featuring information and opinions on how key technologies can be leveraged to solve business problems. Avant Technology Insights is a service of Avant Communications, a platform for IT decision-making. All opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host. For more information, please feel free to download our research reports and other resources at www.goavant.net. That's www.goav as in victory, ant.net. For Avant Research and Analytics, this is Ken Presti.